At Nicholas Carrington's funeral, his fiancée Sophia demands to see his body, but what she finds inside the coffin shatters her world. As she uncovers layers of betrayal and deceit orchestrated by Nicholas' powerful mother, Genevieve, Sophia faces a twisted truth. The day Nicholas Carrington was laid to rest, the sky hung low and heavy, as if even nature bowed in sorrow. His funeral was an elaborate affair, as one would expect from the Carrington family, wealthy, old money, and full of whispered secrets. The chapel was draped in black velvet, silver accents gleaming under the muted glow of chandeliers. Rows of mourners sat in quiet reverence, their heads bowed, though many of them had come more out of curiosity than grief. Everyone wanted to see how Sophia Clark, Nicholas' fiancée, would handle the death of a man whose name was almost synonymous with power. Sophia sat alone in the front row, her dark hair pulled back, her slender hands clenching a white handkerchief. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry, too dry for a woman who was supposed to be heartbroken. Genevieve Carrington, Nicholas' mother, sat 2 seats away, a calculated distance between them. Even in grief, Genevieve was regal, her posture unnaturally straight, her black dress perfectly tailored, as if she was not burying a son but attending another social event. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her lips pressed into a line of restrained composure. The service droned on, but Sophia barely heard a word. Her mind churned over one single thought. She hadn't been able to say goodbye. Not really. She needed to see him, to touch his face one last time, to make it real. It was something gnawing at her, something she couldn't shake. When the priest finally called for the final prayers, Sophia rose, startling the people around her. "I want the coffin opened," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the solemn hush like a knife. There was a collective gasp. People shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, the murmurs starting immediately. This wasn't done, not at a Carrington funeral, and certainly not when Genevieve Carrington was in the room. Genevieve's head turned slowly toward Sophia, her expression hardening. "That's out of the question," she said, her voice low, controlled. Her gaze could have turned glass to ice. "It's improper." Sophia swallowed hard, but her voice remained steady. "I need to see him, Genevieve. One last time." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The tension was palpable, and the guests sat on the edge of their seats, wondering if they were about to witness a Carrington scandal play out in front of their very eyes. Genevieve stood, her height and presence commanding the room. "We are not doing this," she said, each word clipped, as though she were slicing through the very idea with a scalpel. "Nicholas deserves his dignity, and I will not allow a spectacle." Sophia's hands shook as she took a step toward Genevieve, her eyes darkening with a mix of grief and determination. "I loved him. I have the right to say goodbye." The 2 women stood just feet apart, their grief like a storm barely restrained, threatening to lash out and consume everything around them. It was a standoff, one that made the air thick and stifling. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, something flickered in Genevieve's eyes, something cold and calculating. With a slight nod, she conceded, though her expression remained a mask of stone. "Very well. If that is what you want." The guests stirred uneasily as the funeral director, a wiry man who had remained in the shadows, stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He exchanged a wary glance with Genevieve, who gave him the briefest of nods. He hesitated only a moment before moving to the coffin. Sophia's pulse thundered in her ears as the director worked the clasps, and the lid was slowly lifted. The gasps from the crowd were audible, but Sophia heard nothing. The room seemed to vanish, the only thing that existed was Nicholas. Her Nicholas. Her eyes fixed on his face, but the moment she saw him, her stomach twisted violently. This wasn't Nicholas. Not really. Something was wrong. His face, it was Nicholas, but it wasn't. The skin seemed unnaturally tight, the angles of his face all wrong. It was like looking at a sculpture that had been warped by heat. His mouth, his eyes, God, even his hair, something about it made her reel back as if she'd been physically struck. Her hand shot to her mouth to stifle a cry, but the sharp breath she took in only made her feel more nauseous. She took a shaky step back, her knees threatening to give way, the room spinning around her. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, swirling like a swarm of bees, and she could feel their eyes on her, waiting, judging. Genevieve moved swiftly, stepping between Sophia and the coffin, signaling to the funeral director to close it. "That's enough," she said, her voice icy and final. "Close it." The lid shut with a muted thud, but the room remained electrified with tension. Sophia stumbled back to her seat, her heart pounding erratically. What had she just seen? Why had Nicholas looked so wrong? She knew death changed people, but this was something else. Genevieve sat back down, her composure unshaken, but something in her eyes flickered, a brief moment of acknowledgement, of knowing. She had expected this. Sophia's mind raced, her gaze flickering between Genevieve and the closed coffin. She tried to steady her breathing, to push down the bile rising in her throat. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the weight of the room, of Genevieve's silent power, pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The final prayers began again, but the words were a distant hum. Sophia sat rigid, her eyes staring straight ahead, but her thoughts were miles away. What had happened to Nicholas? What had Genevieve done? As the mourners began to file out of the chapel, whispering to one another in hushed tones, Sophia remained seated, staring at the closed coffin. Whatever had been in there wasn't her Nicholas. And whatever had just happened was only the beginning. Sophia barely remembered leaving the chapel. The mourners had trickled out, their eyes avoiding her, as if grief were contagious. Their murmurs faded into nothing but a dull hum. She felt detached, like she was floating just above her body, observing herself from a distance. Somewhere in the haze, she'd heard Genevieve's voice, a tight, dismissive command to the staff to close everything down and move forward with the reception. As if Nicholas' funeral was an event to be wrapped up and filed away. Now, sitting alone in the Carrington Estates drawing room, Sophia couldn't stop her hands from trembling. She clutched her tea so tightly she thought the delicate porcelain cup might shatter, but she couldn't bring herself to drink. The bitter scent of Earl Grey mixed with the faint perfume of lilies from the floral arrangements that littered the house, filling the air with an oppressive sweetness that made her stomach turn. She hadn't spoken to anyone since the funeral, not even the few friends who had come to pay their respects. She didn't want their pity. She wanted answers, but none of the questions made sense yet. She replayed the moment in the chapel over and over, her mind looping back to the same terrifying image, Nicholas, but not Nicholas. She tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the effects of death, she reasoned. Bodies changed. They looked different. But she had seen him before in life, had touched his face countless times. That man in the coffin, it wasn't just different. It was wrong. His skin, pulled too tight, his features sharp in all the wrong places. His eyes, closed, but still somehow unnerving. There was no softness, no peace in his expression, just a lifeless mask of someone who had once resembled the man she loved. Genevieve had stood by the coffin with that cold look on her face, not a flicker of emotion passing over her. If she had felt any sorrow, it had been carefully buried beneath layers of composure. Her steel-eyed stare as the coffin was closed had been enough to freeze Sophia in her tracks. Why hadn't Genevieve reacted? Did she not see it? Or, worse, did she know? A soft knock at the door broke the silence, startling Sophia. Mary, the long-serving housekeeper, entered quietly, her eyes warm and concerned. "Miss Clark, can I bring you something to eat? You've barely touched anything all day." Sophia shook her head, unable to form words. She had no appetite, no desire for anything but answers to questions she couldn't even articulate. The room felt stifling, too thick with memories, with the weight of what had happened just hours ago. "If there's anything at all," Mary hesitated, her face softening with concern. "We're all terribly sorry about Mr. Nicholas." The kindness in her voice nearly broke Sophia, but she held herself together with the thin thread of control she had left. "Thank you, Mary. I need some time alone." Mary nodded and quietly retreated, leaving Sophia alone with the crushing weight of silence again. The hours bled into one another as the light outside shifted from gray to the soft amber of evening. Genevieve had disappeared into her study, no doubt making the final arrangements for Nicholas' estate with the family lawyer. Sophia hadn't spoken to her since the funeral, and she was almost grateful for it. Being near Genevieve's steely resolve felt like suffocating in the same space as a coiled viper. The funeral hadn't given Sophia the closure she'd expected. Instead, it had unraveled her, left her reeling, questioning everything. Nicholas had always been a mystery, even to her. He was charming, generous, but often distant, like there were pieces of him he kept locked away, even from the people closest to him. But she had loved him, had planned a future with him. And now, that future was as cold and lifeless as the body she'd seen. Sophia had thought the funeral would be her final goodbye, the moment she would be able to touch his hand one last time, to press her lips against his cool skin and let him go. But she hadn't been able to touch him at all. Her entire body had screamed to pull away, to get as far from that coffin as possible. Was it her grief playing tricks on her? Or was there something more, something she didn't yet understand? Genevieve's reaction had been far too composed, too measured. The way she had cut off Sophia's moment of grief, her cold command to close the coffin, felt like more than just control, it felt like secrecy. As if Genevieve had wanted to hide something from Sophia, from everyone. Sophia shivered, though the room wasn't cold. She rose from her seat, restless, her nerves jittery. She paced, her thoughts swirling. Maybe she needed to talk to someone, Daniel, Nicholas' estranged half-brother, who hadn't even attended the funeral. He had been Nicholas' only family outside of Genevieve, and though they were barely in contact, there was a reason Nicholas had kept him around, even in the periphery. Daniel might know more than anyone else. But tracking Daniel down would mean admitting to herself that something was deeply wrong, that what she had seen wasn't just the trick of a grieving mind. That her instinct, the cold dread pooling in her gut, was right. She stopped pacing and pressed her hands to her face, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What had she seen? What had really happened to Nicholas? The door opened again, and this time, it was Genevieve. She stepped inside without asking, her gaze sweeping over Sophia with the same cold, impersonal precision as always. "Are you all right?" Genevieve asked, though her tone made it clear that the question was more for show than concern. Sophia dropped her hands, meeting Genevieve's icy stare. "I'm fine," she lied. Genevieve studied her for a moment, her eyes sharp, as if she could see through the lie. Then she nodded curtly. "Good. We have much to take care of." Sophia bristled, the bitterness rising in her throat. "Do we?" Genevieve's lips curved into a small, humorless smile. "Of course. Life doesn't stop because we want it to, Sophia. Nicholas is gone. We must move forward." Sophia's fingers curled into fists at her sides. Move forward, she echoed, her voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. Is that what you're doing, Genevieve? Moving forward? Genevieve's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. We all grieve in our own ways. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. This family requires strength, not weakness. With that, she turned and swept out of the room, leaving Sophia alone with the growing suspicion that Genevieve knew more than she was letting on. And that whatever had happened to Nicholas was just the beginning. Sophia sat at the small desk in her room, staring at the window, though she wasn't seeing the rain that trickled down the glass. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying moments from the past, searching for answers that didn't seem to come. Nicholas had always been a puzzle, a man whose charm had been so effortless that it was easy to overlook the pieces that didn't quite fit. Now, in the heavy silence of the Carrington estate, she sifted through the memories, trying to see what she had missed. She felt like she was living in a haze, trying to separate what was real from what she had wanted to believe. There were signs, small ones, barely noticeable, of secrets. Nicholas had been a man who gave just enough of himself to draw people in, but never enough for anyone to know him completely. There had been times, fleeting moments, when she would catch him staring out the window or lost in thought, his jaw clenched in a way that made her wonder what haunted him. But whenever she asked, he would smile that disarming smile, touch her hand, and say, "Just thinking, love. Nothing to worry about." But now, everything was something to worry about. Sophia leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. She could see his face in her mind, could hear his voice, but the man she remembered didn't match what she had seen in the coffin. What had happened to him? A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She turned, expecting Genevieve, but instead, it was Mary again, her expression tentative. "Miss Clark, may I come in?" she asked. Sophia nodded, waving her inside. Mary stepped forward, her hands twisting nervously in front of her apron. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought I should mention. Mr. Nicholas, he wasn't always the man people thought he was." Sophia's heart skipped. "What do you mean?" Mary hesitated, then closed the door behind her, as if to seal off any potential eavesdroppers. There were times when he would disappear for days. Sometimes he'd come back late at night, looking, not himself. No one ever asked questions, of course. The Carrington family keeps its own counsel, but, she stopped, as if considering whether to say more. Sophia leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "But what, Mary?" Mary's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Sophia. "I don't know what was happening, but I overheard things. Conversations between him and Mrs. Carrington. Arguments, really. She was always pushing him to take his place in the family, to follow in Mr. Carrington's footsteps. But he didn't want that life. I think he was running from something. Or someone." Sophia's fingers curled around the edge of the desk. Running from something that would explain so much, his secrecy, the nights when he wouldn't tell her where he had been, the restless energy that often filled him. But it didn't explain why he had ended up in that coffin, unrecognizable. Why didn't anyone say anything? Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. Mary gave her a sad smile. "People in this house don't ask questions, Miss Clark. Not if they want to keep their jobs. Or their place in society." Sophia sat back, her mind racing. She had always known the Carrington family was secretive, that they kept the world at arm's length, but this felt deeper, darker. Nicholas had been involved in something, and it was something he hadn't wanted her to know. After Mary left, Sophia stared at her phone for a long time before she opened her contacts and scrolled to Daniel's number. Nicholas had rarely spoken of his half-brother, but she had met him once, briefly, at a family event. They hadn't exchanged more than pleasantries, but she knew there had been tension between the brothers. Nicholas had dismissed Daniel as reckless and unreliable, but Sophia had sensed there was more to the story. She dialed the number, holding her breath as it rang. On the fourth ring, Daniel answered. Sophia? Yes. I need to talk to you. Her voice came out shakier than she intended. There was a pause. About Nicholas. Yes. Another silence, but this one felt heavier. I'll come by the house tonight. Don't tell Genevieve. Sophia agreed, her heart pounding as she hung up. The idea of keeping anything from Genevieve felt like playing with fire, but Daniel had sounded wary, and she trusted her instincts. There was something here that Genevieve didn't want her to know. The hours passed slowly as Sophia waited, her nerves fraying with each tick of the clock. By the time Daniel arrived, the rain had stopped, and a thin fog had settled over the grounds. He walked into the drawing room with a confidence that reminded her of Nicholas, though Daniel's eyes were sharper, less burdened by the weight of family legacy. He sat across from her, his expression guarded. I don't know what you've heard, but I can tell you this, Nicholas was not the golden boy everyone thinks he was. Sophia's throat tightened. What do you mean? He had secrets, Daniel said, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. Dark ones. He was involved in things that could ruin this family, things that even Genevieve was terrified of. That's why she controls everything, why she micromanages the estate. She's trying to keep the past buried. Sophia felt a chill crawl up her spine. What kind of things? Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know all the details, but I know he was mixed up with dangerous people. There were times he'd come to me, needing money or a place to hide. He never told me the full story, but from the way he acted, it was clear he was in over his head. The room seemed to close in around her as Sophia tried to make sense of it all. Do you think that's why he's dead? That someone. Daniel cut her off, his voice low. I don't think Nicholas is dead. Sophia stared at him, her heart stuttering in her chest. What are you talking about? I saw him in that coffin. Daniel's jaw clenched. I don't know what you saw, but I know my brother. If he's involved in something dangerous, he wouldn't go down without a fight. He would find a way out. Even if it meant faking his death. Sophia shook her head, disbelief washing over her. That's impossible. Is it? Daniel asked, his eyes steady. Think about it, Sophia. Why would Genevieve be so calm? So composed? Because she knows something you don't. Something she doesn't want anyone to find out. Sophia's mind spun, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Could it be true? Could Nicholas still be alive? The following morning, Sophia woke to the sound of rain pattering against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the thrum of her own anxiety. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling around Daniel's words. Nicholas isn't dead, the idea seemed impossible, unthinkable, even, but a small, insistent part of her clung to the possibility. If he wasn't dead, then where was he? And why would Genevieve go along with such an elaborate lie? More importantly, what had Sophia actually seen in the coffin? The knock on her door came soft but deliberate. She didn't need to ask who it was. Genevieve never came to Sophia's room unless it was with purpose, and that purpose rarely boded well. Sophia pushed herself up, her pulse quickening as the door opened. Genevieve stood there, poised as always, a small, tight smile on her face that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, Sophia," she said, her voice light but lined with something sharper. "May I come in?" Sophia nodded, though everything inside her screamed to keep the woman out. Genevieve stepped inside, glancing around as if she owned the space. In some ways, she did. This was her house, her world. The estate, the wealth, the power, it all belonged to Genevieve Carrington. And Sophia was beginning to realize how little room there was in that world for anyone else's truth. Genevieve took a seat by the window, crossing her legs elegantly. "We need to talk," she said. "About the future." Sophia stayed where she was, watching her carefully. "What do you mean?" "Nicholas is gone," Genevieve said, the words smooth and practiced, as if she had rehearsed them. "You, of course, were a large part of his life. But now that he's no longer with us, things must move forward." There it was again. Move forward, it seemed to be Genevieve's favorite phrase these days. It had a clinical detachment to it that made Sophia's skin crawl. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," Sophia said slowly, though she had a feeling she already knew. Genevieve's smile tightened. "I've spoken with our lawyers. There are arrangements that need to be made regarding Nicholas' estate. You are his fiancé, and it's only right that we discuss what role you'll play in these proceedings." "I haven't even begun to process everything," Sophia replied, her voice barely hiding the edge of frustration creeping in. "Nicholas is dead, and you're asking me about practical matters," Genevieve cut in smoothly, her tone never losing its icy composure. "The world doesn't stop, Sophia. I understand grief, but you must understand that business continues. And I want to ensure you are taken care of." There it was. The thinly veiled offer. Genevieve was trying to push her out, carefully, subtly, with money as a convenient solution. "I don't need your money," Sophia said, her hands tightening into fists. "What I need are answers." Genevieve's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something cold in her eyes. "Answers to what?" Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She thought about what Daniel had told her, about the strange conversations between Nicholas and his mother, the arguments, the secrets. She thought about the unsettling sight of Nicholas in that coffin, the way his face had looked wrong, distorted in ways that still made her stomach twist whenever she closed her eyes. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Sophia said, her voice low. "What happened to Nicholas? What aren't you telling me?" For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Genevieve's gaze never wavered, but the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Then, in a voice as smooth as silk, Genevieve replied, "Nicholas is dead, Sophia. That's all there is to it." It was the calmness that unnerved Sophia the most. The way Genevieve said the words as if they were an immutable fact, a truth that no one could question. But Sophia wasn't buying it. Not anymore. "He didn't look right," Sophia said, forcing the words out. "In the coffin. He looked wrong." Genevieve's lips pressed into a thin line. "Death changes people. It's an unfortunate reality, but one we must accept." Sophia shook her head. "It wasn't just that. There was something else, something you're not telling me. I need to know the truth." Genevieve rose from her seat slowly, the movement graceful but deliberate. She walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. When she turned back to Sophia, her expression was as cold and unreadable as ever. "Be careful, Sophia," she said softly. "Grief can cloud your judgment. You're not thinking clearly. I'm offering you a way forward, a way to heal and move on. Take it." Sophia held her ground, her chest tightening. And if I don't? Genevieve's eyes narrowed, just for a second, before she smiled again, but this time the warmth was entirely gone. I'm sure you will make the right decision. You always have, after all. With that, she left, the door closing quietly behind her, but the echo of her words lingered long after she was gone. Sophia sat there, the room suddenly feeling much colder. She didn't know what Genevieve was hiding, but she was certain now that there was more to Nicholas' death than anyone was willing to admit. Genevieve's calm, her control, it was too perfect, too calculated. As the hours passed, Sophia found herself walking through the house, her thoughts a jumble of memories and questions. She wandered into Nicholas' study, the room untouched since his passing. Papers were still scattered across the desk, books half opened on the shelves, as if he'd stepped out for just a moment and might return at any second. Sophia ran her fingers over the desk, feeling the smooth wood under her fingertips. Her eyes landed on a stack of documents near the edge of the desk, the corners slightly frayed. Without thinking, she picked them up, her eyes scanning the pages. Her breath caught in her throat. They were financial records, transfers, loans, large sums of money moving in and out of accounts she had never heard of before. And they were all in Nicholas' name. But what really caught her attention was a notation scribbled in the margin of one of the pages, written in Nicholas' own hand, pending transfer, Genevieve's instructions. Sophia's heart raced. What was Genevieve doing with Nicholas' money? And why hadn't Nicholas told her about any of this? The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they painted a picture far darker than she had ever imagined. Sophia's mind reeled as she clutched the papers tighter. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just about grief or inheritance. This was something bigger, something dangerous. And Sophia wasn't going to let Genevieve push her out, not when the truth was so close. She slipped the papers into her bag, her pulse pounding in her ears. Whatever Genevieve was hiding, she was going to find out. Sophia's obsession grew like a wildfire, consuming every thought, every breath, every second of her day. Genevieve's veiled threats and calm composure haunted her, a constant reminder that something was deeply wrong. But it was more than that. It was Nicholas, his memory, his laugh, his secrets. And that body. That body in the coffin that had looked so wrong. Her dreams were filled with flashes of his face, distorted, twisted, like something out of a nightmare. When she woke up in the darkness, drenched in sweat, she could still see it, etched into her mind like a scar. Was it even him? After finding the financial records in Nicholas' study, Sophia had felt a shift. Genevieve was hiding something monumental, and Sophia was determined to find out what. She couldn't shake the growing suspicion that Genevieve was involved in whatever had happened to Nicholas, and that Nicholas' death, if it was even real, was part of a much larger, more sinister plan. She needed answers. Daniel was her only real link to Nicholas' past, and though their relationship had been strained, he was the only one she could trust right now. If Nicholas had been running from something, Daniel might have the missing pieces. They met late one evening at a small bar outside of town, far from the prying eyes of the Carrington family and their associates. The rain was coming down in sheets, casting a gray veil over the dimly lit space. Daniel sat in the corner, nursing a drink, his eyes shadowed but alert as he watched her approach. "Thanks for coming," Sophia said, sliding into the seat across from him. She hadn't told him much on the phone, only that she needed his help, and that it was about Nicholas. Daniel studied her for a moment, his expression guarded. "What's going on, Sophia?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I think something happened to Nicholas, something Genevieve doesn't want anyone to know. I found some documents in his study. Financial records, transfers, loans. It looks like Nicholas was involved in something, but I don't know what. Daniel's eyes darkened. That doesn't surprise me. Nicholas was always into something he shouldn't have been. But it's not just business, is it? You think Genevieve had something to do with his death? Sophia met his gaze, her voice steady. I don't know if Nicholas is really dead. The body at the funeral, it didn't look like him. It looked wrong. Daniel frowned, leaning in closer. What do you mean, wrong? Sophia shuddered as the memory resurfaced. His face. It didn't look like him at all. It was too tight, the skin stretched in weird places. His features were distorted. I thought it was just the effects of death, but now I don't think that was it. I don't think it was him. Daniel sat back, his expression hardening. You're saying someone switched his body? I'm saying I don't know what I saw, she said, her voice rising. But something wasn't right, and Genevieve is acting like nothing happened. She's too calm, too controlled. She wants me out of the picture, and she's offering me money to walk away quietly. Daniel let out a low whistle, shaking his head. That sounds like Genevieve. She doesn't care about anyone but herself and that precious family name. Sophia leaned forward, her voice urgent. You said before that Nicholas came to you sometimes when he needed help. Do you know what he was involved in? Why he was hiding things? Daniel hesitated, taking a long drink before speaking. Nicholas was always in trouble. He never said much, but I knew he was mixed up with some dangerous people. He was borrowing money, taking out loans, and not from the banks. From private lenders. Shady types. He thought he could handle it, but he was in too deep. Sophia's pulse quickened. Private lenders? Like criminals? Daniel nodded grimly. Yeah, but not just any criminals. These guys had connections, political, financial. They weren't just loan sharks. They were part of something bigger. I warned Nicholas to stay away, but he didn't listen. The weight of Daniel's words sank in, and Sophia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Nicholas had been in trouble. Real trouble. And if he had been involved with people like that, there was no telling what could have happened. Do you think they killed him? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel shook his head slowly. I don't know. But if they did, Genevieve would have known. She controls everything in that family. There's no way she wouldn't have gotten involved, especially if it threatened the Carrington name. Sophia's mind raced. Genevieve had the power and the influence to cover up anything that might tarnish the family's reputation. If Nicholas had been killed, Genevieve could have arranged everything, faked the funeral, replaced the body. It wasn't impossible. There's more, Sophia said, her voice trembling. I can't stop thinking about the body. It wasn't just distorted, it was like someone had done something to it. As if they were trying to hide the real cause of death. Maybe it wasn't even him at all. Daniel's eyes narrowed. What are you saying? Sophia's throat tightened. What if Nicholas faked his own death? What if he's still alive? The silence between them was thick, charged with the weight of the possibility. Daniel stared at her, his face unreadable, before finally speaking. If Nicholas is still alive, he's in hiding. And if Genevieve's involved, she's not going to let us find him easily. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. The idea that Nicholas could still be alive filled her with a mixture of hope and dread. But if it was true, she needed to find him. She needed to know the truth, no matter how dangerous it was. "We have to keep digging," Sophia said, her voice firm. "If Genevieve's involved, there has to be a trail. There has to be something we can find to prove it." Daniel nodded, though his expression remained wary. "Be careful, Sophia. Genevieve doesn't play games. If you get too close, she'll make sure you regret it." Sophia clenched her jaw, her resolve hardening. "I don't care. I'm going to find out what happened to Nicholas. And if he's still out there, I'm going to bring him back." Sophia's heart pounded as she stood outside Genevieve's study. The heavy oak door loomed before her, a barrier between her and the truth. For days, she had wrestled with doubt, piecing together the fragments of Nicholas' life, his debts, and the unsettling revelation that someone, possibly Genevieve, had orchestrated the whole thing. The truth felt slippery, always just out of reach. But now, she had no choice but to confront Genevieve head-on. She knocked, her knuckles trembling slightly. When the door opened, Genevieve was seated at her desk, her face a mask of calm. Papers lay before her, but her eyes lifted immediately, and Sophia felt the cold weight of her gaze. "Sophia," Genevieve said, her voice smooth and controlled as always. "I wasn't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't," Sophia replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "But we need to talk." Genevieve sat back, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "About what?" Sophia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "About Nicholas. About the body I saw in that coffin. And about what you're hiding." There was a flicker of something, was it irritation, in Genevieve's expression, but she quickly smoothed it away. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Sophia. I'm not sure what you think you're accusing me of, but let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be." "I don't need to sit down," Sophia said, her voice firm. "I need answers." Genevieve sighed, her fingers lightly drumming on the desk. "You're upset, and I understand that. Grief can play tricks on the mind. It makes us see things that aren't there." Sophia's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. "I didn't imagine what I saw in that coffin. That wasn't Nicholas. His face, it was wrong. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Genevieve's gaze didn't waver, but Sophia saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together for a fraction of a second. "The dead do not look the same as they did in life. That's something you need to accept." "I know what death looks like," Sophia snapped, the heat rising in her chest. "But that wasn't just the decay of a body. Something was done to him. Or, whoever that was." Genevieve's eyes narrowed into slits, and for a moment, the polished facade slipped. "You're more stubborn than I gave you credit for," she said, her voice quieter now, almost resigned. "But you're also right." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Genevieve stood slowly, her movements deliberate as she walked to the window. She stared out at the rain-drenched gardens, her back to Sophia. When she spoke again, her voice was low, as if she was speaking more to herself than to Sophia. "Nicholas isn't dead," she said finally, the words hanging in the air like a sword waiting to drop. "The man you saw in that coffin wasn't him." Sophia's knees nearly buckled, but she gripped the back of the chair for support. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Genevieve turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "Nicholas faked his death. The man in the coffin was a decoy, someone whose face had been altered. I paid for it. The mutilation was deliberate, to ensure there were no questions, no suspicions about who it was." Sophia felt the world tilt around her. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. When she finally found her voice, it was shaking. "You're telling me that Nicholas is alive? That you lied to me? To everyone?" Genevieve didn't flinch. "I did what I had to do." Nicholas was in over his head. His debts, his recklessness, it was only a matter of time before someone came after him. He needed a way out. I provided it. Sophia's mind spun, trying to grasp the enormity of what Genevieve was saying. Nicholas had faked his own death. He wasn't in that coffin. He wasn't dead. Where is he? Sophia demanded, stepping closer, her voice rising. Where's Nicholas? Genevieve's eyes met hers, cold and unyielding. Gone. He's far away by now, out of reach. You let me believe he was dead, Sophia choked out, the betrayal cutting deep. You let me mourn him, let me think I was burying the man I loved. How could you do that? Genevieve's face remained impassive. Because you weren't part of the plan, Sophia. Nicholas was going to leave you behind. The money, the estate, it was all going to be handled, and you would have moved on. He didn't want to drag you into his mess. Sophia's breath came in shallow gasps. He was going to leave me? Genevieve's voice softened, but there was no warmth in it. Nicholas wasn't the man you thought he was. He had a darker side, one he kept from you, from everyone. He didn't want to hurt you, but he couldn't stay. His life had become too dangerous. Sophia's hands shook, her mind reeling with the revelation. Nicholas had planned to abandon her, to disappear without a trace. And Genevieve had orchestrated the whole thing, pulling the strings like a master puppeteer. Why are you telling me this now? Sophia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why not keep lying? Genevieve sighed, turning back to the window. Because you wouldn't stop digging. You're too persistent, and I can't have you disrupting the fragile balance that's been put in place. You needed to know the truth, at least some of it. Sophia's anger surged, a wave of betrayal and heartbreak crashing over her. You think I'll just walk away now? After everything? After what you've done? Genevieve's shoulders stiffened. You have no choice, Sophia. Nicholas is gone. He's not coming back. There's nothing left for you here but pain. Sophia stared at her, the enormity of it all sinking in. Nicholas wasn't dead, but in some ways, it felt worse. He had left her, planned to leave her, and Genevieve had made sure it happened. She turned and walked toward the door, her mind a blur of anger, disbelief, and heartbreak. Just as her hand reached the knob, Genevieve's voice stopped her. There's one more thing you should know. Sophia paused, her back still to Genevieve, unable to turn around. The plan didn't go exactly as intended, Genevieve said, her voice cold and distant. Nicholas wasn't supposed to get involved with those people. His debts caught up to him faster than we thought. I gave him an out, but something went wrong. I haven't heard from him since the funeral. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. What do you mean? Genevieve's silence was damning. When she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. I don't know where he is. He's disappeared. Sophia turned, her heart pounding in her chest. You lost him? Genevieve's eyes were as cold as ever. He's lost himself. And in that moment, Sophia knew, she was truly alone in this. Nicholas was gone, Genevieve's carefully controlled plan had spiraled out of her grasp, and now, Sophia was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had shattered around her. Sophia stood in the dim light of the Carrington estate's drawing room, her hands clenched into fists, the echoes of her confrontation with Genevieve still ringing in her ears. The weight of the truth had settled over her like a heavy fog. Nicholas wasn't dead, but he might as well have been. He had faked his own death, left her behind, and vanished into the shadows of his mother's ruthless plan. But now, even Genevieve had lost control. Nicholas was gone. Really gone this time. And the reality of that betrayal, his, Genevieve's, cut deeper than any lie she had ever been told. The fireplace crackled softly in the background, casting long shadows across the room, but there was no warmth in the flickering flames. The air felt cold, hollow, and filled with unsaid words. Sophia's mind raced with the weight of everything she had uncovered: Nicholas' debts, his secret life, the body in the coffin that wasn't him but a grotesque decoy to fool her and the world. Genevieve had gone too far, but now the consequences were unraveling faster than she could contain them. Sophia heard the soft creak of the door behind her and turned, half expecting to see Genevieve, ready with some new manipulation. But instead, Daniel stood there, his eyes shadowed with concern. He stepped into the room, his expression guarded. "I heard," he said quietly. "Genevieve told you everything?" Sophia nodded, the knot in her throat too tight for words. She could barely meet his gaze, her emotions too raw. "I don't know what to do anymore, Daniel," she finally whispered. "I thought finding the truth would help me, but it's just made everything worse." Daniel walked closer, his movements slow, as if he were approaching someone on the verge of breaking. "It's a lot to take in. Nicholas, the faked death. Genevieve's been playing this game for longer than any of us know." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry. She was too angry, too hurt. "She used me. He used me. I thought I knew him, but the whole time, he was planning to leave me." Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, his frustration evident. Nicholas always had a way of compartmentalizing. He kept his mess separate from the people he cared about, or at least, he thought he did. "But you weren't supposed to be a part of this, Sophia. You got caught in the crossfire." The words offered little comfort. Sophia shook her head, the bitter truth gnawing at her insides. "But I was a part of it, Daniel. I was in the middle of it all, and neither of them cared enough to tell me the truth. I had to dig it out myself." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with regret, but before he could respond, a sound echoed from the hall, a soft shuffle, a creak of the floorboards that set Sophia's heart racing. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, and in the doorway, standing half in shadow, was Nicholas. Alive. He looked thinner, his face gaunt, eyes hollowed with exhaustion. His clothes were rumpled, his hair longer, darker than she remembered, but there was no mistaking it. It was him. For a moment, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Sophia couldn't move, couldn't speak, her heart slamming against her ribs. Nicholas stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Sophia," he said, his voice raw and strained. She didn't let him finish. The anger, the heartbreak, everything that had been building for days, came flooding out of her in a wave of fury. "Don't you dare," she snapped, her voice shaking with the force of her emotions. "Don't you dare say my name like nothing's happened. Like you didn't just disappear from my life and let me think you were dead." Nicholas flinched, guilt flickering across his face, but he didn't back down. "I had to, Sophia. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," she cut him off, stepping closer, her hands trembling at her sides. You ran. You ran from your life, from your debts, from me. And you let your mother convince me you were gone forever. You lied to me, Nicholas. You broke everything. I didn't have a choice, Nicholas said, his voice rising in frustration. I was trying to protect you. I was in too deep, with the wrong people. If I had stayed, you would have been caught in the middle of something far worse. Worse than thinking you were dead? Sophia shouted, her voice cracking. Worse than the nightmares I've had of seeing you in that coffin, your face, twisted, unrecognizable? You think this is better? Nicholas took a step closer, his expression pained. Sophia, I was trying to fix things. I didn't want to leave you, but I couldn't bring you into this. It wasn't safe. Before Sophia could respond, a cold, sharp voice cut through the tension. So this is how you come back, Nicholas. Both Sophia and Nicholas turned to see Genevieve standing in the doorway, her face as rigid and unyielding as ever. She stepped into the room, her eyes locked on her son, but there was no warmth, no relief in her expression. I did everything for you, she said, her voice low and controlled. I made sure your debts were erased. I buried the truth, protected you. And this is how you repay me? Nicholas' face tightened, his hands curling into fists. I never asked for your help, Mother. You orchestrated this whole thing. You pulled the strings. Genevieve's eyes narrowed. Because you were too weak to handle it yourself. You would have dragged this family into ruin if I hadn't stepped in. The tension in the room thickened, the air electric with years of pent-up resentment and secrets. Sophia stood frozen between them, watching as the lies and betrayals boiled to the surface. You think this is about the family? Nicholas asked, his voice shaking with fury. This is about control. You've manipulated everyone, Sophia, me, so you could keep everything exactly the way you wanted it. Genevieve's cold mask didn't falter. I did what had to be done. No, Sophia said softly, stepping forward, her voice breaking through the charged silence. You did what you wanted to be done. You didn't care about Nicholas, or me, or anyone. You just wanted to protect your perfect little world. Genevieve's eyes flickered toward her, a cold smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You think you understand this, but you don't. You're an outsider, Sophia. You always have been. Sophia's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. I might be an outsider, but I know one thing, you've lost. Nicholas isn't your pawn anymore. For the first time, Genevieve's expression faltered, her carefully constructed facade cracking ever so slightly. She looked at Nicholas, and for a brief moment, there was something like fear in her eyes. You'll regret this, she said quietly, her voice a dangerous whisper. Nicholas shook his head. No, Mother. I won't. Genevieve turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Sophia and Nicholas stood there, the aftermath of everything heavy between them. But as the door closed behind Genevieve, Sophia knew that the worst was finally over. For better or worse, the truth was out.